we've come up to uplift baby.
In 2019, Newsroom broke a story about Oranga Tamariki's attempt to take a newborn from its mother at a Hawke's Bay hospital.
3 Māori babies a week are being uplifted like this.
The taking of Māori babies from their mothers is a crisis in hiding.
Very shortly after that video emerged, the Labour NZ First Coalition government brought in a new section of the Children's Act known as 7AA that binds the ministry to treaty principles by working more with Māori. But now the new coalition government wants to get rid of it. It comes after a different Newsroom investigation that showed the agency removing children from what was to be their forever home and moving them to whānau they had spent less than a fortnight getting to know.
The same child protection agency who told these children 2.5 years ago they would never have to move again is now moving them.
Broken promises.
Broken promises.
I call it the reverse uplift.
Yes.
It's stories like this that acts David Seymour and Karen Chaw refer to as they stubbornly stick to their plan to repeal 7AA.
This is a coalition agreement, something that I campaigned on, an issue that I promised to fix while I went around the country and heard the horrific stories of how our young people were put at risk because it was based on their race, not their safety.
A move backed by the Prime Minister.
We don't want Oranga Tamariki to focus more on a child's cultural needs rather than their immediate safety and stability. That's what we're focused on.
So if we have the Prime Minister's promise that the children's well-being comes first, why the outcry?
Researchers, iwi, psychologists, health experts, lawyers and social providers made a case to keep the legislation in place, saying there's no evidence it puts children at harm.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Today on The Detail, the history of 7AA and what happens now. Also, what does this say about our select committee process when the politicians continue to ignore the overwhelming submissions against the repeal? Here's Tracy Martin, former NZ First MP and Children's Minister when 7AA was brought in.
7AA is a clause that has been inserted into the Children's Act to require the Chief Executive of Oranga Tamariki to create relationships with iwi and hapu and to report on those relationships and the success or otherwise of them to Parliament once a year.
It was brought in 2019?
So the Act itself was passed into law in 2017 when the Honourable Anne Tolley was the Minister for Vulnerable Children. But this particular clause didn't have to be enacted until 2019 because you needed the new Ministry of Oranga Tamariki to be set up to give them a couple of years to set up, to give them the capacity for the CE to start building those relationships.
So it was kind of a joint effort, I suppose, between you and Anne Tolley. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think it's very fair. I mean, I was very privileged. And after the change of government to the Labour New Zealand First Coalition government, Anne was made an Associate Speaker. What that meant was that I, as the new Minister for Children, actually had the capacity to go and sit down with Anne and ask her, what was your vision, Anne? What was the meaning behind this? What were the drivers behind this? So that I could get an understanding of what she was trying to create when she put the legislation in place.
Interesting, at the time, you called it a circuit breaker. In one of the many articles that have been written about this in recent months, the former MP Willow Jean Prime said it was connected to decades of human suffering. So why was it introduced? What was going on?
There was a lot going on. At that time, the national government, and I hate speaking for Anne, right, but this is my understanding. The national government had a Māori advisory group, and the Māori advisory group, as Māoridom has done since the 1970s and 1980s and since the development of a document called Pio Te Atatu, been trying to get government to devolve the care and protection of Māori children to iwi and hapu. So at the time when this legislation was created, it was an opportunity for the Māori Advisory Group to have a clause inserted that would start or be responsible for that devolvement. And because Bill English set the tone around social investment at that time, this clause finally found its way into legislation because it made sense to shift to prevention and early intervention and use the resources, e.g. the cultural and just physical resources of iwi and hapu to start to move towards investing at the front end for these children and families.
At the same time, or round about the same time that it came in 2019, there was a big story by my newsroom colleague Mel Reid about the attempted uplift in Hawke's Bay. Was 7AA almost a knee-jerk reaction at all? Is it coincidence?
No. I mean, it's coincidence that both things happened in 2019. The enactment clause had been put into legislation back in 2017. It had nothing to do with any particular case that it just happened to be enacted in 2019. It had to do with the organisation needing to be set up before it could start creating relationships. However, I would say, because myself and my mother through whāngai actually are voting members of Ngāti Kahungunu in the Hiratonga, and Nahiwi was the chair of the iwi group at the time. So I went down and met with him because that case actually involved my iwi.
Oh.
Yeah, and so one of the side effects of that particular case was that because of 7AA, we didn't advance a signed agreement, but what we did advance with Ngāti Kahungunu was a relationship on an unofficial basis where we placed a social worker inside the Ngāti Kahungunu Trust, and they walked alongside them to be able to develop their capacity to support their families and children more before it reached an Oranga Tamariki stage.
And is that still in place now?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. I would hope so, because that's the point, isn't it? We want children and families to be supported before things reach a crisis.
But if you don't know if that's still in place now, do you know if it's been successful, if it's worked?
Well, I guess you have to decide what successful looks like, okay? But if what we're talking about is that we get less calls of concern and less children come into care, at the time that we enacted 7AA, there were 6,600 approximately children inside the care of the state. The latest numbers that I saw, it was down by around about 2,000 children. So we managed through that time frame to shift the numbers of calls of concern went down by 28% from 2018, 2019 to 2022, and the numbers of children in care of the state lowered by around about 2,000. So if that's what success looks like, then creating those relationships and changing the way that Oranga Tamariki worked was succeeding.
And you believe that Section 7AA played, a big part in that?
Absolutely. 7AA, here's an example of why 7AA made a difference. Oranga Tamariki has always been challenged to have enough families available for urgent situations. So if they have to immediately move in because they believe a baby or a child is in immediate danger, where do they take that baby or child? In one of the relationships that was signed with a northern iwi, they immediately went out to find 30 families that among their community that they trained to be emergency placements. So they were able to, if a call of concern came that was at such a heightened level that immediate removal needed to take place, the iwi already had 30 trained families that we could shift the children to while everything got sorted out from what was that crisis moment.
So you believe that's because of 7AA?
It was because of 7AA. It had never been done before, and I do not believe that it will continue if there isn't a legislative requirement to do so and to report on it.
So it was doing the job of what? Saving children from harm?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Saving children from harm, but giving us the time to actually work with those very close to that family who knew that family to find out what are the circumstances here. Is there another way that we can keep the children safe and support this family to be whole again without having to use the most extreme power of the state, which is to take their children from them?
This repeal, we knew it was coming because it was announced as part of the government's coalition agreement. But my understanding it's the speed with which the Minister, Karen Shaw, has moved to repeal the provision that's been a shock. That's what I read in an article in the Māori Law Review. Would you agree with that?
I think, first of all, let's just be clear. Nobody knew that this was going to be part of what the government was going to implement until after three men had a negotiation. So that's the first thing, right? So between David Seymour, Christopher Luxon and the Right Honourable Winston Peters, they arranged what was going to be the legislative changes implemented by their coalition government. So this particular thing, I don't recall National or New Zealand First campaigning on. So this was a members' bill of an ACT Party opposition MP, which was voted down in the House at first reading previously. So the country didn't know, and the country couldn't provide a mandate, if you like, on this particular piece of legislation. The piece that I think, and I can't speak for Māoridom, but I think it's very interesting. It's not necessarily the speed, it's the complete lack of conversation or desire to listen to other perspectives. I know what it's like to be an opposition MP and to have maybe 50% of the information and believe you have the solution to a problem. And then I know what it's like to become a minister and now have 100% of the information and realise that you didn't know all of the bits and pieces, and so you need to alter your solution. And I'm suggesting that that's what this case is, and that when the public elects us into these positions, they expect us to have, enough grace and enough, I don't know what that other word is, to change our mind. If it's wrong, then don't do it.
Are you saying that Karen Shaw has found out more now that she's the minister, but she's not willing to undo this particular piece of legislation?
So I'm saying part of what you said. What I'm saying is that the minister now has more information, and I would hope that the minister would then realise that what she thought was true is not true, and so therefore there's no need to remove 7AA.
No other child should endure the cultural deprivation I experienced. No other child should feel lost, out of place, disconnected from their roots.
Without Section 7AA's key statutory checks, tikanga and treaty principles referenced in other parts of the Act have no accountability or enforcement.
There is very strong evidence that cultural connection, cultural belonging, and strong cultural identity buffer against a range of psychological and other health problems.
These are some of the voices at the Select Committee hearings into the repeal of 7AA.
We reject the notion that culture should ever be seen as a barrier to safety.
The repeal of this clause would shift the focus from a system-wide obligation to a reliance on individual staff members who have the willingness and influence within the system and to engage meaningfully with iwi Māori.
RNZ political reporter Lillian Hanley has been at the hearings. She says despite the overwhelming opposition to the repeal, Seymour and Shaw are sticking to their argument that 7AA is bad for children.
Because under Section 7AA, Oranga Tamariki has taken children out of safe, loving, so-called homes for life, and these so-called reverse uplifts put them back into their original household where they were known to be endangered. That's why they were taken out and put in a different house in the first place. And why? Because the house they were put in was said to be peopled by people of the wrong race.
They're also saying if you remove 7AA that they will still, or Oranga Tamariki will still form these partnerships with iwi. But in terms of submitters, they are saying that if you don't have that statutory obligation, then it won't happen, or at least there won't be that reporting. So, and Tracy Martin herself made the point, how do we know? So I've sort of put that to them as well, because you've got this issue of evidence or lack of evidence, and then you've got, I guess, the idea or the ideology, in the sense that for the ACT Party and therefore the government here, what they are saying is that the child's safety comes first, and that's what they are focusing on, and therefore removing 7AA just means that there's that entire focus on Section 4. She is steadfast in that, and she won't budge from that.
She and the Prime Minister keep citing a figure.
We have one child dying every 5 weeks in New Zealand as a result of family violence.
And the current system isn't working.
Multiple people have said that, and I think that nobody is actually arguing that there are children who need help or need support or need to be safe. I think, none of the submitters are ignoring the fact that children at times are in unsafe situations. What 7AA allows is it sort of works just as much as a prevention mechanism, right? So that there are mechanisms in place to try and stop children going into care in the first place, but ensure that families have what they need to have a safe space for a child or maintain safety for a child.
If there is such overwhelming opposition to something like this, does there come a point where Karen Shaw and the Prime Minister and ACT and, the government has to soften their stance?
I put this to David Seymour as well, and actually he made the point that when he did the end-of-life choice legislation, there were overwhelming submitters against it, and I don't know those figures, so I can't speak to that. That was his response. But obviously that went to referendum. In terms of sitting and listening, and we're talking, experts here, we're talking experts in their fields, public health experts, mental health researchers, lawyers, well-versed people with access to evidence and all making their case. I don't want to say strange, but it seems to go against, I guess, what you would expect the select committee process to be, right? Is to hear these perspectives, these positions, and then make law accordingly. That's what we understand our select committee process to be. And again, going back to Tracy Martin, she seems incredibly disappointed that this is happening. She's sort of asking, what's the point in going to select committee? The government should have just gone into urgency, passed the law through all stages that way, rather than kind of go through this tick box exercise, she told me, in the sense that you go through this process, people pay a lot of money to show up to Parliament and say their piece, when nothing's going to change anyway. And I say that because the government is committed to it, but also it's in the coalition agreement. In that respect, it seems like it's going to happen.
Tracy Martin has suggested that they turn it into more of a conscience vote, but Chris Luxon has already ruled that out.
No, the wellbeing of children must come first, and we want to make sure that the focus is on their immediate safety, stability and wellbeing.
Yeah, so I guess in this regard it would be up to Christopher Luxon to change the process or change how they're going to do this in any way. But yeah, he has also been questioned multiple times and is sticking to that position that for them they want to put the child's safety first. And I say that for them because that is their perspective of a child's safety. Whereas as if you listen to a range of submitters, cultural connection doesn't come at the cost of safety. Those two things can be one.
I asked Tracy Martin whether newsroom stories about reverse uplifts have influenced the move to repeal 7AA.
Well, those are the stories that have been reiterated to me as the reason why 7AA needs to be removed. And again, there's a lack of understanding then, isn't there? Because one, the National Party and Anne Tolley specifically removed any whānau first clause from the Children's Act back in 2017. And if you have a look at the Labour Party and Green Party's contributions opposing that bill, it was because they had specifically removed whānau first clauses. So that's the first thing. The second thing is 7AA. If it's being used by overzealous social workers to remove children from a safe environment to a different environment because of their ethnic background, and they've used 7AA to justify it, then they are wrong. And the CE should be called in by the minister and told categorically, this is not what should be happening, stop it happening, and make sure your social workers are aware that this is not appropriate. But taking out 7AA is not the answer to what was those problems.
But if it's not whānau first, what is it? Is it whānau second? I mean, is it the child's well-being first, whoever the carer that they go to?
Yeah, if you have a look at the conversation around whānau first actually refers to Clause 4 inside the Act. So it's Clause 4 that puts right at the beginning the safety of the child as paramount.
And that's why we don't want 7AA trumping Section 4. But we don't want Oranga Tamariki to focus more on a child's cultural needs rather than their immediate safety and stability. That's what we're focused on.
There's no suggestion inside that legislation that whānau first comes before the safety of the child. And Section 7AA literally has very little to do with that conversation at all.
So what's the next step, Lillian? Are submissions continuing?
They are continuing. My understanding is there will be more submissions, but the Select Committee report is due back in November.
Do they make recommendations in terms of, potential changes?
Well, correct. So they look at it and then, I suppose, give a perspective based on what they've heard from submissions, potentially how they could tweak or even whether to recommend it to not go ahead perhaps. But given it's in terms of the coalition government, there will be the number of National and ACT members on that committee. My understanding would be that they would be a majority. So what Labour and the Greens and Māori Party would need to do is submit a sort of differing view, and that goes inside the report as well.
What do you think's going to happen, Tracy, if the repeal goes ahead?
What I think will happen is we will change nothing, and nothing will change. 7AA is the biggest opportunity we have to shift to a prevention and early intervention agency and social circumstance that we've ever had when it came to the protection of our children.
Do you feel snubbed at all? Because this was your baby, I guess, and now it looks like it's going to go, this essential part of the Act.
No, I don't feel snubbed because I didn't create it. As I say, I was merely the person who recognised the vision, recognised the opportunity to stop taking children into care and to do something differently to support our families and their children. So, no, I don't feel snubbed. I feel sad. I guess sad and a little frustrated that others can't see what is the true opportunity here to stop having to bring children into the care of the state.
That's all for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. Thank you to Tracy Martin and Lillian Hanley. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure and Davina Zimmer. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Mā te wā.